Hello everybody and welcome to another Wednesday video. As you probably guessed from the title, we are going to be talking about the Italian Navy or the Regia Marina, and in this particular event we actually have two special guests, both of whom actually are Italian, therefore can speak Italian, and thus I will try and keep my Italian pronunciations to the bare minimum to avoid the grimaces of pain that will no doubt result every time I try and say something. Nevertheless, let's get them to introduce themselves. So if one of you would like to introduce yourself, say who you are, and then we'll go with the other one.
Okay, hi everybody, I'm Giulio Poggiaroni. I'm currently just opened a new YouTube channel on just Regia Marina. So if you're interested in also English content on the Italian Navy, you have a place to go. And from time to time, I also write articles for an American website on the Italians in World War II.
Mm-hmm.
My name is Mirko Campochiari, and I have a YouTube channel called the Parabellum, and I mainly cover military history from 1920s to 1945.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
I forgot to mention the name of my channel, so it's Italian Military Archives. Quite important.
And you also have the Twitter account as well.
Yeah.
So today we've got a grab bag of different topics, some of which are very much talked about, although perhaps with not a tremendous amount of actual accurate information when it comes to English language discussion, and a few others that we thought were quite interesting as well. So we'll see how far we get with them on this one. There may be a part two, you never know. So we're going to lead in with one of the things that is talked about a fair bit, although as we said, perhaps not with all the necessary information to hand, because a lot of it is still in Italian, which apparently not many English-speaking researchers learned to read, which is the accuracy of Italian naval guns, particularly when we come to talking about the 15-inch guns on the Littorio class, and the many competing theories as to why. So I suppose briefly, the two that have the most currency at the moment in the English-speaking world, at least as far as I can see, is one, the idea that the quality control on the charges and the shells was awful, so that they were all of different weights, which would explain a lot of the dispersion issues, although it doesn't explain why sometimes the dispersion was actually pretty good. And then the other one, which has come out a bit more recently, is the theory that being a very high velocity guns, the shells were actually overly spin stabilized. And so instead of following a nice gentle ballistic arc with the noses coming down as the shell comes down, they actually still went through that arc, but with the noses pointed up. So they ended up kind of flying sideways at the end, which again would explain why it was inaccurate at times, wouldn't necessarily explain why it was inaccurate at other times, except for a colliery theory that I came up with in the dry dock at one point regarding the wearing of the rifling and everything. But that's kind of where things mostly are. What have you guys got to tell us?
So regarding the 15-inch guns, so as they are known in Italy as the 381/50, they were designed to be very high velocity guns, and this was because they were the largest naval gun developed in Italy. And we know that in the 30s, they were developed in the 30s, of course, and the treaty limitations in that period called for a maximum caliber of 406 millimeter. But Italy couldn't develop such caliber because, as you know, Italy was the least of the great powers and didn't have the capacity to do so. So they had already experience with the 15-inch gun, because they designed a model for their own super dreadnought, the Caracciolo class, which was never completed. Only one was launched, but then scrapped soon after the launch. So there was some experience with this caliber, and then in the 1930s, this new model was developed. And to, let's say, bridge the gap between the maximum theoretical caliber, the 406, they designed these guns to have a very high velocity so that they could have a huge range, and a higher penetration degree, let's say. This, of course, meant that the phenomenon that you explained before was very likely to happen. So perhaps this is one of the theories that we can accept, although the sources and the accounts, the war diaries of admirals, also especially Giacchino, they attribute this also to other factors, as you also mentioned, the quality of the propellant charges and let's say weak quality checks that were conducted by the industries on the projectiles. So the high velocity of the gun was an issue, although it's interesting to note that before the Littorio actually started their trials and their firing training in the summer, early 1940, the Regia Marina observed the problem of dispersion also with the 320 millimeter guns on the rebuilt Cavour, and also on the 8-inch gun, so the 203 millimeters of the heavy cruisers. This was attributed to a series of factors. Actually, there was a committee, a group of admirals who gathered and discussed this problem, because this was observed in the trainings and the trials in the between 1938 and 1940. And they came up with a series of hypotheses. Again, the high velocity of the guns, which was also a feature of the, especially the 8-inch guns. Errors originating from the firing control devices. Another theory was the closeness of the gun barrels, which you may recall from the design, the shapes of the Italian cruiser guns. The guns are very close to each other. This because they were mounted on, they were placed on a single mounting, so they could not be elevated independently. This was done for saving weight, mostly. And basically the blast of one gun would have influenced the other one, and this would have had a detrimental effect on the accuracy. Then they also listed the problems regarding delays in the transmission of information from the range, the firing control directors and the guns. And also, again, at the end, one of the admirals that participated in the committee, which actually was Admiral Bergamini, the one who in 1943 went down with the Roma, he raised the problem, the issue of the theory of the low quality of the projectiles and of the propellant charges. So this is already before the trials on the 15-inch gun of the Littorios. Then they also noted that the high velocity of the 15-inch gun had meant that the barrels had a limited life. They are estimated around the lifespan of a barrel was between 110 and 130 shots. So after that, you would have to rechamber the barrel, which was quite difficult operation to carry out. And the Regia Marina then decided to decrease the amount of explosive of the propellant charges. This was mainly done for extending the barrel lifespan, but also to reduce this problem. Although in the very first trials of the firing trials of the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto, they didn't observe a tremendous dispersion. Let's say we have 4 engagements in World War II in which the Littorio class actually fired. And these engagements saw the Vittorio Veneto participating in the Operation Gaudo. This is how we call it in Italian. So Operation Gaudo, it's the sortie of the Regia Marina that in March 1941 that ultimately led to the disaster of Cape Matapan. The engagement that of the day before, the Vittorio Veneto engaged the British cruisers at ranges of 23-25 kilometers. And in that occasion, they observed quite important dispersion of the guns. And Drag, tell me if I recorded well. Also the British observed this quite large dispersion and during the engagement.
Yeah, they noted that some of they could tell which ship was being fired on just about, but they noted that some of the shells were coming closer to other ships in the battle line than the one that was notionally being targeted. And there's a few photos taken which actually show it's taken from the perspective of one cruiser, and you can see there's two more cruisers that the picture's being aimed towards. And you can see that there's a 15-inch plume that's quite close to the cruiser that is the perspective for the cameraman. And there's a few more scattered around. I believe it's HMS Perth, if I recall offhand, which is the nearest ship. And then there's more splashes which are beyond the next cruiser, which, given the sort of apparent perspectives of how far apart they are and the lengths of the cruisers in question, you're talking about a dispersion of well over 1 kilometer to 1.5 kilometers, which is effectively be at the point that's being aimed at, because clearly that's the safest point. Anywhere else at 1.5 kilometer radius, you might get a random shot, but yeah, it's quite bad.
Yeah. So, and in that particular engagement, we have also to take into account that the Littorio Veneto actually fired 94 shots at distances between 23 and 25 kilometers, which is a distance where you don't really expect to hit something. So this is already also something to consider. And in the engagement, the HMS Orion was damaged by splinters. So as we will see later, the data that we have regarding the actual fights in which the Littorio class battleships were engaged, I would say they are not sufficient to make the claim that their dispersion was very high, because they fired at very long distances at not a huge amount of shells. In November 1940, there was the clash of Cape Spartivento. And there also the Littorio Veneto participated in that engagement and actually fired 19 shots, which are almost nothing, at ranges between 28 and 32 kilometers. And also there were no hits. There were no particular reports denoting a very high dispersion. But then we are talking about 28 kilometers. You don't really expect to hit something at that distance. Back on the dispersion that was observed at before Matapan, this very high dispersion raised the issue again of the quality of the propellant charges. And it's interesting to note that in summer 1941, the Italian Navy conducted a series of firing trials. Also then some night fighting exercises, which they acknowledged they were important after Matapan. And in the first, let's say, round of trainings, Admiral Iachino actually had to call off the trainings because they really observed that there was a problem with the propellant charges. There were a lot of shots that were not actually fired due to the poor quality of the charges. And then they had to call for another series of trainings, I think a month later. And this time they relied only on the propellant charges coming from one single manufacturer, from which they very thoroughly assessed the quality. Those were more, let's say, encouraging. So actually the claim that was done during wartime on the quality of the propellant charges, initially raised by Bergamini and also reinforced later by Iachino, I think it's something that we really have to consider. And then closing perhaps on the other two engagements in which the Littorio class battleships were engaged. Actually, the Littorio, the other battleship, the Littorio fired during the first and the second Battle of Sirte, which are two somewhat forgotten engagements of the Mediterranean War, but they are quite important, not really for the tactical outcome, but on the impact, the strategic impact that they had on the Mediterranean campaign, and also on the North African the land operations in North Africa. So in the first clash, the first Battle of Sirte in December 1941, the Littorio fired 27 shots. So again, not statistical significant amount of shots, fired at distances over 30 kilometers, and no hits were reported. So I would say that they're hitting something at those distances would have been very, very, very lucky.
Yeah.
And the second clash, which occurred in March, this time the Littorio fired 181 shots at distances between 10 and 17 kilometers. But there is a but, because this clash occurred in very specific weather conditions. There was poor visibility. The wind was blowing against the Italian fleet, and also the sea conditions were extremely rough. In fact, the Italians, after the battle, they lost 2 destroyers because the sea was so rough that they couldn't keep up, and they were sunk by the storm. During this engagement, again, the Littorio fired his shots, and two British ships, the HMS Eurylos and HMS Kingston, were damaged by the splinter. I think on the cruiser, a splinter basically exploded in the water and then cut through the hull, and I don't remember if ended up in the water on the other side or just stopped in the internal side of the ship. But again, these I would also call them not significant data, because the conditions were extremely against the Littorio. And also we have to remember that in that occasion the British fleet laid down an immense smoke screen, which prevented further prevented the already poor visibility during that day.
Yeah, although if I'm remembering the order of sources correctly, I believe, although as you said, Littorio didn't hit anything at the first battle, the observations of the dispersion were that from the British side of things, the dispersion wasn't too bad actually, because as you say, it's over 30 kilometers, so that's well beyond any historical actual hit that was scored. But I think that the dispersion on that particular battle, if I'm remembering correctly, was actually considered to be in line with what you'd expect for battleship shells coming in at that distance. And this has always been one of the things that's puzzled investigations, because if everything was uniformly bad, that would, you know, there's as we've said, a number of explanations where you say, well, that's why. But the fact that the dispersion sometimes seems to be completely awful and other times actually seems to be fairly good, whilst the Italian range finding certainly seems to be absolutely spot on and up to par, has complicated things, to say the least, when it comes to trying to work out what's causing it all.
Yeah, and then so let's say, to sum up, we could say that the quality of the charges, it's a factor that we really have to consider, and also the design, let's say the flow design, but I would necessarily call it a flow design, the high velocity of the guns. We can theorize that the deterioration of the barrel could cause the dispersion, maybe. This could be a factor. But also, when we saw there are in the let's say the main source on the Littorio class, which is the Littorio class battleship from Erminio Bagnasco, there are data on the fire training exercises conducted by the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto, and we were a bit puzzled because we saw some kind of different data between the guns of the Vittorio Veneto and the guns of the Littorio. I'm saying this because we are talking of the same gun, but this gun were the guns of the Littorio were produced by Ansaldo. The guns of the Vittorio Veneto was produced by the Otto, another Italian company. And this different data raised up another theory that it's very, very complicated to explain, but it deals with the quality of the steel that the Ansaldo use, and perhaps Mirko could add something on this if you want.
Yeah, it was a week ago. I did a video together with a historian that works at the Italian headquarters. Okay, so he have a lot of access on documents. And while we were talking about Cavallero, which was the guy that pretty much managed Ansaldo in the 20s and 30s, we come up to a story that maybe link to this story and can solve this puzzle. Pretty much when he was managing Ansaldo, he got involved in a lot of corruption regards misplacement of materials, namely stuff like bad alloys sold to the navies and things like that. So it will be very interesting to know if it's the Ansaldo cannons that performed worst than the other one, because that may reinforce this theory, which is proved because later he got problems and he got a lawsuit regards this administration, and since he administrated pretty much until the late 30s, probably that's why these cannons got problem. Not only the cannons, it was a general problem regards also other parts for the Navy, but mainly for the Navy. So if Giulio confirmed that is the Ansaldo version that works worst,
no, actually,
probable.
Not necessarily. It's from the data. It seems that in the very first trial, those from 19, let's say the first round of exercises, the Ansaldo guns performed more bad compared to the other ones. And this could I mean, at least this rank as the bell, but again, it's quite I'm not an artillery expert, so I couldn't say if the gun built with this steel, this kind of poor steel, has an effect. And then if you consider that the gun has to be rebarreled after 100 or so shots, I don't know if from the engineering point of view this has an impact, but still it was interesting to go through this theory. Again, it's impossible. I think it's impossible to determine if the guns produced by Ansaldo were produced with this poor steel. But again, it's something that was interesting to bring up, I think.
Yeah, the scandal is involving the fact that he was selling and producing certain components with less material than needed. So let's say it was copper and titanium. He was trying to be cheap with the most costly, because the more they were cheap with the high costly material, the more they were taking that money for themselves. And there's a book written about the Italian industry in the 20s and 30s by Curami, and that's where you can find all the information about this kind of stuff. But trying to go back and recognize, which order was delivered and then use it exactly for that cannons, it's an incredible task.
There was definitely an issue with the armor plates, especially those used later for the tanks, produced by Ansaldo. But again, we also know from also Kurami, the historian that Mirko quoted, that also the Navy, before these scandals, before the 1930s, they were not really enthusiastic about Ansaldo. So there are lots of dots that maybe point in some direction, but we will never know. But I will stick to the going back to the dispersion. I will stick to the theory of the propellant charges and the too high velocity of the guns. Although again, the combat experience doesn't give enough information, sufficient information to claim that the dispersion was actually too bad, because we know there are other, I mean, the dispersion issues affected most navies. Also the French guns on the Richelieu class had an extremely awful dispersion. So
yeah, and I think the thing that's important to remember, especially for the viewers, is that actually we have this slightly contradictory information where the spread sometimes at the longest ranges seems to be quite good, but then at shorter ranges is quite bad. And as you said, there's not a huge body of evidence as there is for some guns that are used for an extended period of time, like the British 15-inch 42. But none of these theories are exclusive to one another. So, you know, we've got, were the propellant charges good quality enough or not? Were the shells manufactured good quality enough or not? Were the guns manufactured with sufficient quality steel or not? Was the gun velocity too high in terms of the blast interfering with each other, which we know was a problem on other ships when the barrels were too close? And the stabilization issues, and did that make the shells too stable in the air? And if as the gun barrels wear down, which we know obviously they would wear down quite quickly, could that affect it in action? And my little theory in that respect is that perhaps actually as the guns wore themselves from new, they would enter a zone where they were actually had better dispersion, because they would become less spin stabilized, which for most guns is bad. And as HMS Terror would prove later on off the North African coast, if the barreling wears, if the rifling wears out completely, the things become completely unstable. But if a shell is overstabilized, then as the rifling wears off, you'd actually become less stabilized, but that's good for dispersion before you reach worn out stage, and then it becomes bad for dispersion again. But the thing is, it could be one of these, it could be a combination of these, it could be all of them. And depending on where each of those factors stands, you'd get a different result every time you fired the gun. So you could have you know, best case scenario, you could have maybe a half-worn gun that's maybe had 50, 60 rounds put through it, and you've luckily got a good batch of propellant charges, and your guns are made by Otto, and the shells are a good quality batch, and that maybe the velocity is not quite as high as it was initially when they've reduced the charge slightly. And in those circumstances, you might be able to get excellent dispersion at really long range, which is reflected, as I say, I believe it was at first Sirte with Littorio's guns. It may have been Sparta. I will have to put a line in the bottom to say which one it was after I've double checked. And then the converse is you could have the worst combination of factors. So poor quality propellant, poor quality shells, Ansaldo guns, and brand new barrels, or perhaps barrels at the end of their lifespan, and then all of a sudden it's almost like you're firing a Call of Duty shotgun, and the shells are just going into something approximating the direction you were hoping they would.
Yeah.
So so I suppose that hopefully brings up, although we haven't come to any definitive conclusions, because unfortunately we don't have any
we don't
guns to test.
Yeah, exactly. Even the sources are not, let's say, definitive on that. They list all these issues, the theories that Admiral Iachino came up with regarding the propellant charges. Also, he raised issues also with the quality of other devices used on the battleship, but these were also, let's say, calmed down by other post-war authors. But yeah, this is definitely there are, as you said, there are multiple explanations that
and I think that the important thing is that we've brought forward a couple of additional points that aren't really talked about much, if at all, in English literature, and emphasize the fact that, you know, there are these other things there. It could be one or more of these things, but there's a lot more to it than just a simple dismissal that, oh, the Italians can't make decent guns.
Yeah, no, because actually there
at
are
the receiving end of it, with the British cruisers were fired upon for all the fact that the dispersion in that particular case was awful. Having read the survivors' accounts of that period, literally the first thing they did when they noticed that actually by the shell splashes, they noticed this isn't 8-inch gunfire anymore. The British cruisers weren't sitting there going, "Oh yes, well it's the Italian battleships. Clearly they can't make a gun for toffee. We'll be fine." They went, "Okay, no, we're out of here." The commander of the ship who was writing the account was basically looking at all these shell splashes and going, "Right, well, if the leader dies, I think it's Gloucester. So if Gloucester dies, right, then it's down to Orion. If Orion dies, then it's down to me. And I don't really want to think about what happens if I get killed." So they had a healthy respect for the fact that they were being fired up by the Italian battleships.
Yeah, and then again, when you are fired at by a 15-inch gun, yeah, you may observe the dispersion, but if you are on a cruiser, the first thing you do is you run. So we know that hitting a target in naval engagement, it's not the necessary condition for victory. You can you can hit no targets and being victorious at the end.
If you make the enemy cede the field, you've won by default. Yeah. So I guess that brings us on to our second topic. So I suppose we're going to talk a little bit about Italian naval policy in the 20s and 30s. I mean, it's what gives rise to all sorts of interesting things. I mean, obviously, we've got the Littorios, which we've talked about a bit now. We've got probably the most extensive refits and modernizations of battleships with the Cavours and the Dorias. And then you have this whole slew of other interesting things. So some actually decent treaty cruisers, even if they slightly cheat on the displacement. And then this the very early adoption actually of twin gun mountings in destroyers predates pretty much everybody else's adoption. The next ones are the Japanese with the Kagera. I think it's the Kageras or the Fubukis, whichever one the big super destroyers in the late 20s are. And then this interesting sort of almost unique set of light cruisers as well, ranging from everything apart from just fractionally too big to call a destroyer all the way up to full-scale ones. So I guess the question needs to be asked, what on earth was the Italian naval policy in the 20s and 30s that gives us this rather unique balance of ships?
As most of the European countries after World War I, Italy was going through some economic problems, also social turbulences. As we know, let's say the Biennio Rosso, the 2 red years, and then later the rise of fascism, that were pretty troubled years for Italy. And but anyway, the Regia Marina sent its envoys to the Washington to discuss what would have become the Washington Naval Treaty. And in the Washington Naval Treaty, Italy was allowed to retain the same amount of capital ships as France. And this was seen as a major victory for the Regia Marina because they were put on the same level of the French, which was absolutely not granted. So this was seen as a victory. And at the same time, Italy and Regia Marina saw the French and the Marine Nationale as the future possible opponent in the Mediterranean, because with the disappearance of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and so let's say the Italian control over the Adriatic, the other plausible opponent was France, because until then, the Italians never considered the British as an enemy because they were too much superior, and because there was a story of friendly relationships. Already at the time of Benedetto Brin, which is a guy who Mirko will cover later, already Benedetto Brin identified the Marine Nationale as the opponent towards which the Italians should have built their policies and naval policy and naval construction. So basically, in a nutshell, the naval policy of the 20s and 30s was to counter the naval constructions of the French, or maintain a certain level of parity between the Regia Marina and the Marine Nationale. This started already with the treaty cruisers. We know that the Washington Naval Treaty called for the battleship vacancy. So until 1931, nobody could build battleships. France and Italy were allowed to build battleships already in 1927 and 1929, because at the time of the signature of the treaty, their current capital ships were not exactly valuable. Let's say, for instance, Italy had no super dreadnought. They only had dreadnought with 305 millimeter guns. So they started to design the new kind of ship that emerged from the Washington Naval Treaty, which was the treaty cruiser. In Italy we call this cruiser Tipo Washington or Tipo Trattato. And the first design that came up was the Trento class, and was let's say a direct response to the first cruise post-war French cruiser, I think were the Duquesne class and Duguay-Trouin class. They came up with this fast cruiser that could reach, I think, 35 knots, and armed with eight 8-inch guns. They laid down 2 of these ships. They took quite some time to build because of the problems with the shipyards, with the industry, the economic restraints, and so on. But then the Regia Marina is not super enthusiastic about the results they come up with. They think the protection is not sufficient. And so they immediately, at some point, they also think about selling these 2 ships to Argentina, but then the whole thing doesn't materialize. And they come up with a new design, which is the Zara class. And the Zara class are, let's say, very well designed ships. They cheated the treaty limitations, because they reached, I think, 12,000 or 30,000 tons. So they exceeded by almost 3,000 tons the treaty limitations. They were a bit slower than the Trento, but they were extremely protected for heavy cruiser standards. And this because at the time of when the Zara class was designed, we are already in the years around 1926-27, in which Italy and France have the chance of building new battleships. But then there's a tacit agreement between France and Italy to not building new battleships, because the 2 countries are not experiencing, let's say, a good economic moment, or the military budget do not allow for great expenditures, let's say. And then in the space of 2 years, there would be also the 29 crisis. But then there is also, at least in the Regia Marina, there are people who are not convinced that the battleships will have a future. In the late 20s, they knew that in 1931, there would have been new negotiations on naval disarmament. And nobody was sure about the new limitations on the battleship construction. And there were people like Admiral Bernotti, Admiral Taon di Revel, was the guy who led the Regia Marina during the Great War. But based on the experience of the Great War, in which they saw the battleships being easy prey for torpedo boats, submarines, mines, and with the rise of the air power, they were not really convinced that the battleship was the future. Let's say there were nor the economic conditions, nor the political will to move in this direction. And so France and Italy decided to avoid laying down new battleships, and instead the Regia Marina thought of building a new series of treaty cruisers. But since this cruiser should have acted as the core of the Navy, they would have required a higher degree of protection compared to the Trento class. And so they came up with the Zara class. Then the Zara class is the last class of heavy cruisers, because what happens next is that they concentrate most of the naval programs in the late 20s and 1930s. They take into consideration the light cruisers, what will be known as the light cruisers. So they start with the Giussano, Cadorna classes, and which are not satisfactory. The Regia Marina is not satisfied with this early designs, and then they come up with the Montecuccoli or the Duca d'Aosta and the Abruzzi classes, which are very, very well designed cruisers, light cruisers for the time, and then nearing the the French in 1931 they built the Dunkirk. They built the Dunkirk because the Germans built started the construction of the Deutschland class, and so the Italians reacted to the construction of the Dunkirk by rebuilding the Cavour class, because at the time still the negotiations were still we know that in 1930 there was the London Naval Treaty which extended the vacancy to 1936, or at least the new term was moved to 1936. So at the time the Regia Marina was still uncertain about the future negotiation, and they thought about not laying down a new battleship because it would have meant costs, and again, what's the future of the battleship in 3 years? And so they came up with the idea of rebuilding the Cavour class. So they take the Cavour and the Giulio Cesare, they basically rebuild 60% of the ship. Their length is increased by around 20 meters. They received a brand new torpedo defense system, the Pugliese system. Their guns are rebarreled and the caliber is increased to 320 millimeter guns. So they are considered to be a sufficient response to the Dunkirk, because on one side you have this modern battle cruiser, on the other side you have these two rebuilt battleships with are a stopgap solution. They were seen as a kind of stopgap solutions. And then what happens next is that the French built another Dunkirk class battle cruiser, the Strasbourg. At this time, there is a new guy, let's say, leading the Regia Marina, which is Admiral Domenico Cavagnari, which has become the Chief of Staff of the Navy and the Navy Undersecretary. And he's a supporter of the battleships. He convinces Mussolini to respond to the Strasbourg by laying down the Littorio class. Mussolini was, according to the sources, he was a bit reluctant because they meant a huge amount of money for a country like Italy. But then the ships are laid down in 1934, and then the French respond with the Richelieu class. So this is a naval escalation initiated by the French, but then fueled also by the Italians, let's say. And this is pretty much it. We have then we know the Italians, the Japanese don't participate in the talks for the renovation of the naval treaty, and then basically the naval disarmament by 1936 is pretty much over. Everybody starts building new ships, and then we get to the war. I'm simplifying a bit, but again, the Italian naval policy was responding to the French naval construction, and you have in the first period, so from 1920 to 1931, let's say 1932, you have the development of heavy cruisers and light cruisers. And then later, the battleships come back, and you have the rebuilding of the Cavour class, the Littorio, and then the very questionable decision of rebuilding the Duilio class. Because in a way, it was there was a reason behind the reconstruction of the Cavour class, because again, they were a stopgap solution in a period of uncertainty. In 1937, when the Cavour are ready, and the Italians decide to rebuild the Duilios, the naval race has started already. You are basically free to build brand new battleships, and so why wasting resources, I would say limited resources, in rebuilding two ships which are already inferior to for instance, the modernized British dreadnoughts like the Queen Elizabeth, the Valiant, and so on. So this was, I mean, the historians, Bagnasco and the others, are quite puzzled by this decision, and they haven't come up with a clear answer to this. And for instance, not building the Duilios probably would have meant an earlier completion of the Littorio and the Vittorio Veneto, and even an earlier completion of the Roma and the Impero. So this is a very strange decision that was taken in 1937.
Fair enough. So I suppose it's something that's going to be eternally debated, especially considering, as you said, there's stopgaps to the first two are stopgaps to deal with the Dunkirks. Well, the French aren't building any further Dunkirks, and no one else is building similar ships. Everyone's moved on to the big ships. So the Germans are building Bismarck and Tirpitz, the French building the Richelieus, British are building King George V. But I suppose it's a question that, well, it's a question for eternal debate, which is good because it means we all have something to do. So just check looking at the time. So there's definitely going to be a part 2 if everyone's happy to go with that. Otherwise, we will be here forever. But we do have one more section which we can't cover today, and that means Mirko actually gets to say more than 2 words, which I'm sure he'll be grateful for. Otherwise, he showed up for nothing. So we've had a look at the World War II and the guns. We've had a look at the interwar period and how the Italians were formulating their naval policy there. But if we go even further back, although obviously Italy has a very long and rich history, its history as Italy, as opposed to Venice, Genoa, Milan, Sicily, the Neapolitan kingdom, etc., is actually relatively recent. So shortly after we actually have Italy as a thing, we have the Regia Marina with Benedetto Brin, and of course the rather unfortunate for the Italian side of things, Battle of Lissa. So perhaps you'd like to give us a little bit more information on a critically underappreciated designer of ships, in my opinion, but also what you've termed in our notes as the Lissa complex.
Yeah, you want to start with the Lissa, or you want me to start directly with Benedetto Brin? Because Lissa happens before, and then Benedetto Brin tried to reform everything.
Mm-hmm.
Let's go with Lissa first, and then Brin, because one informs the other.
So Italy still not really Italy at the time. We are in the third independence war for Italy. We call it the insurgency in Italy, insurgency wars. And we just lost an important battle because Italy at that time was allied with the Prussians to attack the Austrians, because we wanted the Veneto, which is a north region. And at the same time, we also allied ourselves with the French, because why not? You know, if one doesn't guarantee, the other will that we take. So we go very motivated, and we lose a big battle called the Custozza. We lose the battle, but anyway, the Prussians win everything on the other side. So pretty much the Austrians are forced to give the Veneto also because we have Napoleon III on our side as the French. At the same time, when we lost Custoza, pretty much and here we started to see the Italian politicians again. Pretty much the president and the prime minister pretty much sent the Italians, say, we need a victory. Before this war is over, the Prussians are already winning on the other side, and if we want to claim something, we need to have a victory. And since the army is defeated, the only way to obtain that victory is pretty much the navy. Now, the Italian navy was, how I can say, a monster with a lot of heads, because it was a fusion from the Sardinian navy to the Naples navy and other minor navies. And one fun factor is that essentially we call the Austro-Hungaric navy, but technically it was the Venetian navy, to the point where the official language of the Austrian navy was Venetian language. It will become German late in the early 19th centuries. That tells a lot how pretty much Italian defeat Italians in a sense. So they were forced to accept an engagement, in the sense that the Austrians were poking at the Italian, and Persano, which was the admiral, was forced to get out and engage. The problem was that the majority of the ships hate each other, in the sense that the admiral from Naples and the admiral from Sardinia really didn't collaborate between each other at all. They hate each other, there was envy, and also the status of the fleet was completely unprepared. There was many ships with not full complements, no training. Some ships didn't even have all the cannons. So the idea was to go to take Lissa. What is Lissa? I think in English is the Battle of Vis. It's a small island in the middle of the Adriatic, very near to the Croatian coast, I think, today. And it was pretty much a fortress for the Austrian. No really big strategic value, in the sense it's not an island that have any monetary value in that sense. I think the civilians back then were less than 5,000. So, and it was also a fortress with a lot of cannons and mortars. So Tegetov, which was the admiral of the Austrian fleet, think that the Lissa push from the Italian fleet is just a fake, not a real move. But he decided anyway to move his ships in a three formation V-shaped, pretty much first line, second line, and third line. And maybe he got lucky, but he intercepted pretty much the Italian fleet while he's forming, and what he's going to perform is very near to what Nelson did at the Trafalgar. Pretty much he crossed the T. He crossed the T and he intercepted pretty much the Italian first squadron, between the first Italian squadron and the second Italian squadron, while the third Italian squadron was pretty much also later. He got problem because the admiral didn't engage in the battle at all, so he was court-martial for that.
Maybe he didn't want to help Persano.
Yeah, or he didn't want to help because it was from another navy. I don't remember if it was from Naples and Persano was from the Sardinian navy. Italian had a lot of problems in that sense, a lot of internal rivalry, etc. So what happened is that the first squad gets surrounded by the Austrian and get demolished. And in Italy, we say a funny stuff, because we say that the enemy fleet was a wooden fleet with iron men, while we have an iron fleet with wood men, because technically the Austrians were inferior in numbers. We need to remember that this is a battle with ironclads and some age of sail ships. So we are talking about, ships like a Victory-like kind of ships, like the Kaiser was one of the ships that they had there. And what happened was that the Austrians win. They sink 2 Italian ironclads, and the Italian, I think, just damage one, and nothing else happens. So the Italian retreat, and Persano, when I arrived in Italy, he declared victory. Until a couple of days later, he got disproved by the fact that the Austrians lost no ships in the fight, and they had 7 ironclads against 12. So the Austrians were heavily undergunned in that engagement. And here it started the Lissa complex of Italy, in the sense that where the politicians send a fleet to engage for purely political reason when they are not ready, they are not trained, and they are not capable of bringing a victory, even if they have more numbers and more ships, even of superior quality, because many of the ships that the Austrian had was wooden ships. So what happens is that the majority of the admiral involved into this in Italy get court-martial or deranked, and then Benedetto Brin pretty much take the staff from here, and he say, okay, we need to redo everything in this navy. So he wanted to build up this navy, and most important, Benedetto Brin, more than an admiral, is an engineer. So the first thing he do, first of all, he was from the Sardinian Navy. He started in 1864, and together with Simone Pacoré designed Bon. He was the first Italian that wrote about that we need to have a modern fleet made by ironclad. Benedetto Brin take over this theory and bring it forward, and now since he make career also in the Italian parliament, he becomes senator, he have the ability to push also building program. So in 1874, he starts to pretty much build 32 new ships. The majority of them is ironclads, of course. And then when he got the wallet, the Navy wallet, in Italy we say portafoglio della Marina, he pretty much augment the money for this program. And in 1877, pretty much, he make another program. Furthermore, consider he's going to die in 1898, and before he died, he planned over 200 ships from all sides, from the small one to the big one. So at the end, pretty much over 90% of the fleet that Italy have at the start of the Belle Epoque is pretty much something that Benedetto Brin decided. So it was a very important person in that sense, also because the Italian started to make, thanks to his program, some very revolutionized ship for the period. I'm talking about the Caio Duilio ship, because it was an ironclad or a pre-dreadnought with 4 cannon with 450 millimeters that even scared the English Navy at the time, because initially they wanted to make this ship with the same plating of the English ship, and then they made the test. The Italian did some tests that Benedetto Brin directed, because he was an engineer, and he pretty much decided to abort the system that the English used, for example, in the inflexible ship. And then he made this new system, which was pretty much wood, metal, a sort of a lamellar system or a multi-layered system, which was tested, and it was immune by its own weapons. 420 millimeters could not penetrate this new protection system. So that's why they did, and it was completely immune by pretty much any 320 millimeters caliber, which was the standard of the period. So that pretty much accelerated also a new production ships in the other navies, and some consider that the biggest and most beautiful ship of the period. You know, the top of the top. Even the other navy look at these ships with envy, which for Italy, which is a country since 20 years, you know, it was something to be proud about. Unfortunately, that ship never seen combat because it become obsolete, and the next ship that will become the next Caio Duilio pretty much will suffer an explosion in World War One. Probably misplaced the charges inside the ship, and it caused the death of 450 people. So the guy you duly name doesn't bring much lucky, I suppose. Also, most important that Benedetto Brin did was to build not only the navy but the academy. I live in Livorno, and in Livorno the academy was founded by him, and he also unified the other academies, and also he gave big impulse to the Italian heavy industries. So Ansaldo and other industry that come, or the big heavy industry in Terni, was all started by him in a sense. And unfortunately for World War II and Italian history, he also started the Taranto base. So it's another problem. But the entire Italian naval history is pretty much based on the work of this guy. So it's a very important figure, and I think it's a figure that not many know. I think internationally is not very...
Not even in Italy.
Not even in Italy.
Not even in Italy.
Even if when I was in elementary school in Italy, my elementary school, of course, being in Livorno, was Benedetto Brin. So yeah, not many people recognize the work, and most important, because it was the fact that he was an engineer, I think made a lot of difference, because he was thinking in a very different way, and he was looking for data. Instead, choosing something like we know when the Italian renewed the ships in the 30s, he just looked purely at the data. If that system is better, we're going to adopt that system. And it's a very different...
he was a true organizer here.
Yeah,
engineering
state of
is
mind.
State of mind. Yeah.
Yeah, a state of mind was completely different from the politicians and the other that simply build stuff because you need to have parity with France or something like that. And as Giulio said before, he was the one that recognized France as the main competitor, because back then Italy was even invited to occupy Suez together with England, and they refused it. This is a long story of Italian don't understand global strategy. Imagine if we had Suez when we invaded Ethiopia later and nobody could sanction us for that. So yeah, Benedetto Brin probably deserve a bit of spotlight for pretty much creating the entire Italian Navy, from the production to the ships to the training of the troops, because the biggest problem that we had in Lissa was that the people were untrained at all levels. The commander, even some ship had problem with engineers not able to use the engines internally because it was the first time pretty much.
Because also at the time, most of the Italian ironclads were not built in Italy. They were built in foreign shipyards, and so there was additional time required to understand how they work and how to train
they need a lot of time to customize themselves with the ships that they buy, so that they didn't know how they work. And also Italian Navy never had a fight as a navy. That was the first time.
And I think it's important to bear in mind that when you look at the 19th century, obviously when you get into the 20th century, certainly the first couple of decades are dominated by what's the German Navy doing. But if you look at the period from, say, the start of actually before the ironclad period, maybe going back to the late 1840s, early 1850s, I think it's always a good thing to look at what is the primary navy on the planet doing, where is its focus, who is it responding to, and that's where you see who's actually doing a very good job. Because if you're doing a good enough job to make the primary navy turn around and go, hang on a minute, but we better react to this, then you're probably the one who's got the leading edge. And when you look at, from, let's say, probably the latter half of the 19th century, initially it's France. So you have Napoleon, the world's first purpose-built steam-driven wooden battleship, and then you have Gloire, which forces Warrior, and then you have, during the 1860s, you have this whole ironclad arms race between Britain and France. And Warrior and Black Prince, when they're launched, they go straight into the Channel Fleet. The Channel Fleet, which obviously right opposite the French coast, becomes the premier posting for the Royal Navy. But then when you get into the 1870s, it starts to change. And now, granted, the Suez Canal opening does also make something of a fairly major increase in importance for the Mediterranean as a whole. But HMS Devastation and Thunder are pretty much the last ships that are built primarily with a French opponent in mind. You mentioned Inflexible earlier, which was kind of built in almost competition with the Caio de Wilio, and apart from maybe in whole form, actually lost because it turned out you could fit bigger guns on the Italian ship than you could on the Inflexible.
And a better protection system.
Yeah, and this is where you start to see a sudden change, because now all of a sudden the Royal Navy is building coastal fortifications in Malta and Gibraltar, not in England. And Inflexible and subsequently HMS Alexandra, which for quite a while in the 1870s and 1880s is held to be the jewel of the fleet as far as the Royal Navy is concerned, they spend most of their lives in the Mediterranean. Yes, the French have the Toulon squadron, but the majority of the French fleet is still on the Atlantic and Channel coast for all the good it did them in the Franco-Prussian War. But then, sort of 1870s, 1880s, the Royal Navy goes from being a Channel fleet focused navy to a Mediterranean fleet focused navy, and it's after the Caio de Wilio, you have the Italia, the ironclad that may do pretty much without armor, but may do with a very interesting complex cellular system of protection, and that kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. The Royal Navy doesn't switch its focus entirely from one part of the sea to another without a major reason to do so. And granted, the Suez Canal does play a part in it, but the Royal Navy already had a Mediterranean squadron and a squadron in what today we call the Middle East and the Indian Ocean. So they could have gone with beefing those up. But if the main focus is still France, you'd expect the Channel Fleet to still be where all the new ships go. But then all of a sudden in the 1870s, it's the Mediterranean fleet, and in particular basing around Malta, which is right. This is the other thing, if you're mainly thinking about the Suez Canal being your main strategic focus in the Mediterranean, you expect the fleet to be based in Alexandria. They had, at various points, the British have some rather interesting relations with Egypt, whether they're directly in control or just kind of in control. But you don't see the Mediterranean fleet mostly basing in Alexandria or any of those eastern areas. It's mostly basing itself in Malta. And the main reason you base yourself in Malta is because you're worried about Italy, because it's about the closest you're going to get to Italy. And again, if you're worried about the French, you'd probably base in Gibraltar for the most part, because it's a bit closer and you have the opportunity of going either into the Atlantic or into the Mediterranean to attack the Toulon fleet. So I think there's a very long-winded way, I suppose, apologies for that, of saying that, it's a fairly neglected period of naval history for a lot of people, this sort of the latter ironclad period. But when you look into it, when you've got the biggest navy in the world turning around and going, actually, we need to keep an eye on these Italians. They're doing some very interesting things and we don't particularly like it because it might threaten our position in the area.
I think there is a lot of shift in the period, because think about Italy emerged as a power. Benedetto Brin, I think by the late 1800, bring pretty much the Italian Navy to be the third in the world.
Yeah.
Directly behind England and France.
Yeah, and the Russians have the numbers, but they're all over the place, so nobody's worried about them. The Russians have never been able to concentrate the naval forces in one place.
They tried, if you remember.
Yeah,
it didn't work very well.
No.
Right.
But that's what happened around the world between 1870 and early 1900. Around the world, we have the Battle of Tsushima. We have Lissa 40 years before, etc. And then we see other navies appearing. It's obvious that for the English, France was the main competitor, but now you have the Italians, you have Japan, which in Italy was an ally during World War I, etc. And then it became more and more a competitor. And then, of course, we have the Germans unified, which they start to ramp a gigantic fleet in proportion for the small amount of colonies that they had. And not many talk about, but the Austrian fleet, considering how small was the portion of the Austrian Empire that was on the sea, it was quite sizable for the time. So the Mediterranean theater, if you look, have four navies: the Austrian one, the French one, the Italian, the English, and then you can consider some Turkish and Russian also on the side, but is a very small sea where there is a lot of concentrated navies.
I mean, the Royal Navy knew they were the superior navy, but still they knew they had to deal with anybody. I mean, as we mentioned before, the Italians were generally in friendly relations with Britain, but still prevent any alignment between France and Italy would have been fine and in line with British foreign policy. So it's an inferior navy, but still a navy that pops up interesting ideas, and you have to deal with it.
And I think
Julie, you need to consider the politics of the period. Italy was allied with Prussia and France. They could have been also allied on the sea, potentially. It will put, I think, the British fleet in Mediterranean inferiority.
And the Mediterranean fleet only stops being the premier Royal Navy posting pretty much a couple of years before the Dreadnought race kicks off, at which point they're very much focused on the rise of Imperial Germany. But it's an interesting period to look at. And I think the other thing that probably, again, maybe a lot of people aren't aware of, which again is what I call it's another one of these almost unbiased ways of measuring the value of a navy and its designs, is who's buying what. The British shipyards, to be fair, they've got enough capacity to build and sell to practically anyone who'll shake some coins at them. But arming everybody to fight everybody and then picking up the pieces afterwards is very much British foreign policy for the last 1,000 years. So that's not exactly unusual. But when you look at the export market of warships, which is really strong in the 1870s through pretty much the end of the First World War, when it becomes banned for the most part, you see British warships popping up all over the place. You see a few French-built warships popping up, especially in the Russian Navy towards the end of the 19th century. But actually, it's Italian-built warships that are very commonly found across the world. The Japanese have a few. Almost everybody in South America who has a navy of any note buys at least one or two ships off of Italy. A number of minor powers in Europe buy Italian ships or Italian-based ships.
The Greeks.
Sorry?
The Greeks.
Yes, the Greeks. I mean, the Georgios Averov, much as it is a Frankenstein hybrid of almost everybody, it's at its heart, it's a Pisa-class armored cruiser that they happen to have slapped some different guns on.
This could be a direct influence of Benedetto Brin, since he was an engineer and he put a lot of attention into the technical part of the Navy. Probably they overproduce an amount of naval engineers that the Italy, with the amount of resource they had, they could not absorb. So it become a sort of export dream for engineers and Italian knowledge.
Cuniberti, perhaps the guy who theorized the dreadnought style battleship at the same. I think it's still debatable. It's before or at the same time as Fisher. He basically was educated in an environment shaped by Benedetto Brin, so this tells something.
So for Benedetto Brin, the most important person in a fleet, not was the admiral, not was the sailors, it was the engineers that project the ships.
Which, as an engineer myself, is something I heartily agree with.
Also, it's interesting fact because Livorno, the city where I live, it was for a long time the British base in the Mediterranean. So there was a lot. There is even today. There is the English cemetery from the 1700s. So it was a very interesting place where to be with the Benedetto Brin and the military academy here.
Yeah. So
I just wanted to add a note to what we were saying before about the Italian exported ship. There is also the Soviets built by the Tuscan, and I was also noticing that the I think the Molotov, the cruiser Molotov, I don't remember the name of the class. They were built in the Soviet Union, but their design was basically the Montecuccoli design. That's you see the profile, it's the Montecuccoli design.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is obviously another very important thing that, as you said, a lot of people are not necessarily aware of. Now, given the time constraints, we'll probably, if that's all right, wrap it up at this point for today. But we do have 3 other topics to talk about. So stay tuned, everybody, for part 2, because we're going to be talking about some, Benedetto Brin and his engineers wasn't the limit of Italian inventiveness. Next time we'll be talking about a number of things, but including what the Italian submarines managed to get up to at various points, especially in the Second World War, because again, Second World War, if you say submarines, people first think, oh, it's obviously the Kriegsmarine U-boats. Maybe they think about the Pacific campaign with the Japanese and American subs. But nobody really talks about what the Italians were doing, despite the fact that the Italians were getting up some very clever tricks, and B, actually pulling off a number of operations that the larger navies tried and either didn't get as far down the road in progressing or actually tried and failed at, where the Italians succeeded.
Also, Alexander, if I remember correctly, the Italian had the biggest submarine fleet in the world back then.
Yeah, and then obviously, in classic British fashion, there were a few things that the Italians did that the British looked at and went, "That's a good idea. We're going to mercilessly steal and copy that and pretend we came up with it all along." Yeah, I mean, it kind of helped after you put a couple of our battleships on the bottom of Alexandria Harbour that it was fairly obvious that this was a workable idea. But nevertheless,
also special forces, like Decima Mass and others, which started to make.
We covered this.
we will cover this in part 2. So as I say, stay tuned for that and more as we learn more about the Italian fleet. Thank you very much to both Giulia and Mirko for coming today. Hopefully you've enjoyed yourselves. Yeah, we'll see you all again in another video.
Bye-bye. Thank you for having us.
Goodbye.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.